Ready? Go!
Pete Wolfendale actually is around, so he's going to jump in pretty soon to talk about this if you want to discuss the left-right thing from his perspective as well. If we want to keep the conversation going on this.
Sorry, you're saying who's jumping in?
I can.
Razor.
Peter Wolfendale.
Oh,
Peter
okay.
Wolfendale. I can't get rid of Razor right now. But Peter's here. He can jump in about a few minutes, maybe.
Right.
This is like Dr.
Is that
Phil.
anything?
We've got Pete Wolfendale behind the cut.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to say it just in case, I don't know if the dialogue is dead or not, or if we want to keep going, because he will be ready soon. I just shared with him the link.
And I mean, I don't know, is Pete Wolfendale in tune with this Salamea thing? Is this something that he would also be endorsing or not? It's some kind of weird angle to that.
Not as much as Ezra. I'm sure he's aware of this text. I also mentioned it to him to see it, but he hasn't responded to that yet.
Because I'm taking it, if we get to the roots of this thing, I mean, we're at a very high level of like philosophical abstraction on this now. But the comment from Friedman that obviously I expect to be hugely controversial is where he says, we need more competition in government. He takes that as completely on the basis of what he's already said, like totally straightforward. And I don't think there's any jump from that to then treating the rejection of global governance as basically axiomatic. I think if you're coming from the left and saying, well, what is this libertarian right assumption that we're totally unhappy about, I think it would be, and they were going to put it in the most dogmatic possible form, I think it would be fair to say that it is a rejection of the principle of global government, precisely because that's an obstruction to competition, government competition. So if I'm on the basis of nothing, I mean, I haven't read this article Amy's linked to yet, but if it's true that the implication of that is global government and the concrete instantiation of this universal is global government, then of course we have our contention then, straight clearly. But yeah, then I mean, hi Pete. We're discussing this extremely ignorantly because Amy's read it and linked it, but I don't think it's not been on our agenda, and I don't know about anyone else. I haven't yet read this text.
I haven't either. I can see the basic logical structure of the debate, I think. Right. So and it's interesting to kind of view it in terms of parallels between theoretical and practical reason. And how unification sits across the two. So, for instance, if we weren't talking about competition between conceptions of government, but truly what we're really talking about is implementations of those conceptions, right? But if we weren't talking about that kind of competition in the practical domain, but we switched this into the theoretical domain and wanted to talk about competition between conceptions of reality, say between like quantum loop gravity and string theory, for instance, right? This would give us some useful ways of thinking about what are the conditions under which that competition is possible, and what actually is the aim of that competition. Like what is the thing that competition is supposed to be realizing, right?
Yeah.
In the theoretical domain, I think it's fairly transparent, right? We want some kind of unified picture which gives an appropriate description of all of the phenomenon that both models do well, right? And the question of the conditions of possibility of doing that, as something like being able to navigate between the two models, such that you can see. So you need some kind of like minimal conception of what the two models agree on, in order to see how it's possible for them to even have a reasonable disagreement. There needs to be some identification of commonality in order to...
That only, some of these problems only come in from that side, like obviously from the side that we've been working from, to do with geopolitical fragmentation and competition. It looks a little bit different. Like if we to go to your second stage here about what are we trying to do in this competition, we're trying to select and therefore eliminate the dysfunctional model, and find a criterion that is completely non-partisan between these models that will act as a criterion of selection, and eliminate the bad model and preserve the good model.
I think that's precisely what's at stake. The reason I try and kind of like project this over into the theoretical domain is that in the theoretical domain, it's fairly obvious, or at least I think it's fairly obvious, that the conditions for doing this thing you want to do, like selecting the best thing, right? Getting rid of error, right?
Right. Yeah.
Involve some kind of shared methodological framework, right? Some actual kind of base level of agreement that enables disagreement and then ultimately integration, right? And selection of an appropriate model, right?
Well, it's agreement only once you've done the translation to the theoretical, isn't it?
Yeah, but
there's a level of competition which is pre-theoretical, and that you retrospectively try to understand, well, what is it that, why did this work and why did this not? But that's retrospective on the fact that competition has actually done its work and eliminated the bad model and preserved the good model.
This is where the fundamental disagreement lies. Is I think there are much more complicated conditions of the sorts of political competition you're talking about, right? Just as I think that there are these complicated conditions of possibility in the theoretical domain, I'd say they're there in the practical domain as well, and that any sort of notion of just straight out primacy of competition, geopolitical fragmentation, essentially ignores them. It just kind of pushes them off to one side and reifies competition in order to justify some notion.
Yeah. No, it does do that because it doesn't think we can agree. And the whole point is that we can't agree. If we could agree, we wouldn't have the problem. So we have geographical fragmentation because we can't agree. And so it substitutes for the whole question about agreement and disagreement.
The deeper question is, what the fuck is agreement in the first place, right?
That's a theoretical question, like you say, but it's only when you say deeper,
right? It's a question about what's the structure of the practical domain.
Yeah, from a certain philosophical point of view, it's deeper.
But
it's not deeper from a practical point of view, though, is it?
Well, it is if we're
from the practical point of view, it might be intractable.
No, right? I mean, this is the thing, right? We're talking political philosophy here, right? So we've got to be willing to answer the kinds of questions that political philosophy is.
Well, I think that's already an interesting question. Like, I think it's true, it's within the genre of political philosophy, but it might be that by construing it as political philosophy, one is already dogmatically presupposing certain structures that can't be rigorously presupposed.
Yeah, but
and in particular, I mean the structure of theoretical agreement or disagreement as being primary over spatial separation.
But the alternative is you might also be dismissing structures that have to be presupposed, right? There's a flip side to this, right? So
but when you say have to be presupposed, what do you mean by have to there?
In order for the very notion that we were discussing, this idea of competition over something like a form of government to even make sense, right?
But does that, how fundamental is it making sense, Ivan? I mean, the fundamental thing is that you can either separate and defend your sovereignty or not. You know, whether or not that makes philosophical sense is surely then the secondary issue from a realistic point of view over the fact that you have actually effective independence.
Look, if you want to get out of this debate about political philosophy and go away and just act, right? Fair enough. But insofar as we are talking about what political action is, right, you can't just get out of that question, right? You're saying, well, I'm advocating a certain kind of political norm, right? Well, when you're advocating that, right, you're under a certain kind of obligation to make it make sense, and I'm going to hold you that obligation.
To enough people to make it realistic. I mean, this is something that, you know, we're obviously looking at this Patri Friedman essay. I don't know whether you know it. It's in the sidebar here, where it's called Beyond Folk Activism, and it's his argument for this kind of thing. And his whole point is that you can't, these,
yeah,
in the public domain, the universalized public domain, this stuff is hopeless. This is his starting point. It's not going to work. All that you can try and do is have a project and a constituency that is realistic proportions, and just persuade those people that you need to persuade in order to actually start this experiment. Wow. You know, as we were saying earlier, it's an empirical thing. It's not rationalistic. He says explicitly, there's no a priori rational construction that can possibly manage these things. We can always be surprised by it. And so what he's trying to do is just scale it down, de-universalize it to the point where you can have a realistic party of escape.
Well, the thing is,
and try something.
The thing is there is an a priori thing in the vicinity here. It's not what he's attacking, but it is here, right? Which is computational tractability, right? If you push this all the way down in the practical domain, just as you push it in the theoretical domain, it ends up being like, look, if we do things this way, right? If we try and process the relevant information, right, and engage and work through our desires and work towards some sort of solution this way, it's intractable given the resources we've got, the space, the time. Like, we can talk about this stuff in a prioristic terms, right? And what that tells us is, fundamentally, we just need some heuristics, right? We are just going to have to make certain decisions about how we do things, and they're not going to be perfect, and we're just going to have to. But right, when we're talking about what those kinds of decisions are, right, we are doing this thing of talking about the conditions governing the process of agreeing and disagreeing, either in the theoretical or the practical domain, right? So I'm happy to sort of recognize that we're confronted with a certain sort of irreducible practicality, right? There's a certain kind of, at some point you've got to stop talking and just do, right? But when it comes to trying to talk about what kind of political structures we should have, there are different options for configuring how you go about handling these questions of tractability, right? So I don't know if I'm making no sense here to people, but basically, loosely, if one of the things that is sort of implicit in this kind of discussion is, well, look, is it possible to make democracy work, right? Well, I'm sort of saying, well, look, that ends up being a question about implementation, right? And that's a question about sort of computational tractability of designing an actual democratic system capable of handling,
yeah.
Right?
But I think that one thing I'm not sure where you're on this, Pete, is Friedman's thing is we want lots of things to be tried, and a lot of them will fail. You know, we're not looking for a single global, universal, consensual, rationalistically justified system, and we'll be confident that will work. We're just absolutely not. We're going in the opposite direction of that. We're looking to try a whole bunch of different things. Some of them are highly reckless, probably almost certainly going to fail, but maybe could just turn out doing amazingly. You know, whatever we do, we want a lot of it, and built into that is a lot of it is going to fail. So it's like plurality is fundamental. So if this heuristic of agreement, we can agree. I mean, I'm sure Friedman too would like to agree that we're going to do this. You know, we'll agree nominally that we're all going to do different stuff. But if agreement is stronger than that, and agreement is supposed to be, agreement actually begins to inhibit experimentation, then obviously he sees that as the problem rather than any part of the solution. Yeah, because you know, you're now not doing stuff, you're not trying stuff, you're missing out on possible lessons, you're missing out on a discovery process because of the fact that you have set this precondition that there should be some large-scale agreement about what you're trying to do, and that's the opposite of what he's trying to recommend.
Yes, but I mean, there's sort of two things. One is, like I say, we're arguing normative political philosophy here, right? So we're trying to make the case for something we should do together, even if, right, that thing
all that is split.
Split, right? Now, my personal way of going about this, and this is where obviously there's this big split between left and right here, is that it just turns out that there's more implicit in the very demand you're making there. Like there's more agreement, more required agreement in there than you want. You want that agreement to be as absolutely as minimal as possible, and you can't have it, right? But put that to one side for now, right? Let's keep on with this analogy with theoretical and practical, because precisely that's the analogy which is actually active here in the notion of experiment. And the idea that, well, we just want lots of experiments, we want as many different things that can be done. Why? Because the idea is that some of these things can be fed back to us. Like if one group do something really good, everybody else can do that if they want, right?
Well, I'm not disagreeing that is a spin-off benefit, but that by far is nowhere near a sort of fundamental condition of the legitimacy of these things. I mean, if it's just, you could equally say one of them might work and everything else go to shit. I mean, that's also fine. You know, I mean, it's not, as far as I'm concerned, there's no axiomatic condition that it serves the geopolitical collectivity at all.
But it's
It's
why are we interested in success and failure at all? Why is there any rhetoric of success and failure involved in this?
Well, because it's just on Darwinian grounds that something that doesn't succeed dies, and you know, so I mean, it edits itself out of reality, and so anything wants to succeed if it wants to lead to.
Why is this a norm? Why is this something that we're saying we should have as much of this as possible? Why?
That should be more normatively obvious to a human being, I think, than anything that you've discussed so far. If you're asking why humans should exist, then you're already lost.
No, I'm not asking why humans should exist, right? I'm asking
why should there be more of them? Why should there be more societies?
No. Why should, right, the norm that we're interested in, right, be brute Darwinian?
It's inescapable. You can't. There is no alternative. That's what it is.
No, brute Darwinianism is the way things are. It's not the way things should be, right? It's not actually normative at the end of the day. It's just a brute existential fact. If you're interpreting that.
Well, that's what normativity is.
Not at all. Absolutely, and like screw the naturalistic fallacy in all of its forms. But okay, let's a slightly different perspective, right? I mean, I'm quite serious about this. Like, whenever you just appeal to Darwinianism as just like a brute normative given from which political philosophy must start, right? You're admitting you don't have an argument, right?
No, I think that's right, because an argument implies agreement, and we've given up on agreement. I mean, that's what Friedman's whole thing is. Agreement isn't going to. If you're waiting for agreement, you're waiting for the Messianic kingdom.
It presumes
so in the
that
absence of agreement. Yeah, sorry.
it presumes that agreement is even a rational possibility. And there's nothing about democratic states that makes me suspect that they're capable of reaching any kind of rational decision about anything. If anything, it seems more obvious that they're controlled by emotions and psychology and whatever else. So if you want to construct, if you're a constructionist about this and want to arrive at the correct system of society, you're probably not going to get there democratically.
Fine, but that's a side question. As soon as you're talking about stuff like the correct system of society, you're outside of Darwinianism. You're talking
Right.
about...
No, I don't think that's necessarily true.
Like, you're
I
talking
mean, there's a Darwinian translation of that, which is just there's a functional adaptive system of governance that will survive in a fragmented environment without overriding.
Great. Now we've got something slightly more substantive, right?
But why is this not just Darwinism, though, which I thought was the problem?
Well, okay, look. The stuff comes in when you start talking about system of government, right? What is it that survives, right? Oh, the system of government, right? So what we want is the best, most successful, most adaptive system of government. What's a system of government, right? If what survives is the ruins of human civilization, right? But it survives for a very, very long time, right? Then obviously that's not what we're interested in, right? If
I'm not really quite following. I mean, what is meant by the ruins of human civilization?
well, for instance,
the human species that would survive or not in this model, because that's actually already quite a serious
okay,
task.
yeah, okay, it is.
Is the problem here that, like, Pete, you're arguing that this assumption of like a Darwinian fundamental bedrock upon which the organization of governmental structures is kind of founded is an unavowed norm. It's a norm,
Yeah.
and it's completely unavowed. Whereas it's kind of saying this is just the structure of the universe, and anything that is pretending that this is not in play is, you know, in a political fantasy land. Is that the problem?
Yeah, basically, because the skip is between, like, the all the normative content is contained in the idea of surviving. Well, in what survives. Let's put it that way, right? What I'm sort of saying is, if what you're specifying in any case is the survival of an adaptive system of government, or let's put it very, very minimally in terms that Nick, I think, would agree with, right? Intelligence, in some sense, right? What we want is, if just an absolute minimum and basic, we're talking about the survival of intelligence, right? I'd want to say something slightly more than that, but let's just say that, right? Then that's where the normative content has been introduced into your framework, right? We might agree that okay, yeah, then what we want is maximal experimentation in order that we get the most survivable forms of intelligence. Fine, right? But all the kind of normative content of that is in what you're taking to survive.
But I've got a problem with this way you're using normative, which I'm assuming is within this big sort of fact value distinction, all of this Western structure which I think is deeply problematic. I mean, if it wasn't that intelligence is demonstrably adaptive, then I don't think there would be any defense of intelligence worth a damn. If it was the fact that every society that had ever had intelligence had paid a huge price for it, any species that had intelligence had been driven quickly to the edge of extinction, if it wasn't that descriptively it was demonstratively adaptive, then it would just be a bullshit, arbitrary normative element, and I would totally agree. Why the hell would we agree with that? It doesn't belong there. So the only reason intelligence plays this role is the fact that it's not on one side of the fact-value distinction. If you're, intelligence optimization is not a normative decision any more than it is a descriptive evaluation of what is successful in an absolutely stripped down Darwinian environment. So I just don't think the fact-value distinction has the kind of purchase on this that you're wanting to give it.
Let's put it as simply as possible, right? Seeing that, right, we should, right, redesign our society. If that redesign just means split, right, that's still a design decision. That we should redesign our society in order to optimize, right, for the adaptivity of intelligent systems. Right, that is a
I think you could economize that, just say to optimize intelligence production, because I think any definition of intelligence that isn't already doing that is not worth having.
Yes.
I'm not interested in definition of intelligence that makes it some kind of luxury feature of extravagant whatever. It's like it's either intrinsically essentially adaptive or it's not an interesting thing.
Yes, but there's a difference between saying that intelligence is essentially adaptive and saying that what we should do is act in order to maximize this. That's your normative claim, right?
But is there a difference there? Is it not that? Is that recommendation not only to exactly synonymous with saying we should aim for adaptive success?
No,
we should aim to survive.
It absolutely isn't the same thing because there are alternatives, right?
Because what?
There descriptively, right, are alternative paths other than the optimal, right? We're saying we should actively intervene to produce some optimal state, at least on your position, right? And obviously, I have my own claim about what I think is optimal and what I think we should be doing, right?
But are you also making the claim that it is intrinsically adaptive or not? You're saying we should do this irrespective of its adaptive consequences.
No, I just have a very different conception of what I have a different conception of intelligence and adaptation, but also the point of doing any of this stuff, right? The thing I'm just trying to kind of to get at is like, Kit, we could collectively as the human race, and we all should recognize this, we could do things in such a way that we don't end up at the optimal state, right? That we end up wiping ourselves out and any nascent artificial superintelligence, and there you go, right? We're saying that we shouldn't do that. We should do things such that we reach some optimal state. But that's a substantive claim. You can't get to that claim simply from defining intelligence as adaptability. You can't get there from here. That's the naturalistic fallacy. That's the hard line of it.
Yes, I mean, I reject the whole notion of the naturalistic fallacy. I think it's an occidental philosophical illusion based on having taken a very wrong path. So that doesn't really have any weight with me.
Well, that's the core of it. But the thing is that it doesn't have any weight with you. You end up in an Nietzschean position, which is you end up, on the one hand, claiming that you don't care what anybody else thinks and that you are just going to do what you do because that's the fundamental level of engagement with the world. And on the other hand, endlessly trying to persuade everybody else to see things from your perspective. In order to
no, but it's not everyone else, though, is it? I mean, if we're on this Patchy Friedman thing, the starting point of his thing is it's completely pointless to think that you're going to persuade everyone else of anything.
Okay.
That's the absolute axiom
Maybe
that you're
not
basing this on. You just want to persuade a realistic number of people to do what a particular program. Scale the program down to that size. he's under no illusions. That there's no universal political program that he thinks is realizable that he would find attractive.
Well, let me retreat, and because I recognise bringing in this Izzort stuff is not getting us anywhere, right? But so let me retreat onto the terms of what is the best system for producing adaptive intelligence, for optimizing adaptive intelligence, right? Because that's the standard which is governing this idea of fragmentation. And maybe you're right on that front, but there are some reasons to think that you might not be right on that front. And this is why bringing in the parallel between theoretical and practical reason and unification in the sciences is worthwhile, right? Which is, there's a reason that the sciences in the theoretical sphere are not radically fragmented, right? Like all of the computational resources that are given to the sciences, and by that I don't just mean pieces of computing systems, I mean the brains, the people, the books, all the stuff that's doing all the computation of processing information about the world and building some kind of, or rather a patchwork of various models to describe what the world is, right? If all of those computational resources were isolated from one another, if you got all the sciences and you put scientists and you just put them on their own, right, and made them work in isolation, right, you wouldn't have what you have. It would be completely impossible, because
Sure.
you need the pooling of computational resources
Yeah.
in order to get that, right?
So,
And
but no, none of these microstates we're talking about are autarkic, are they? I mean, Hong Kong and Singapore and all of these places are massively, they're the most open societies in the world. So I don't think anyone is arguing that fragmentation means information isolation. Quite the opposite. Information isolation is much easier in another type of ecological system.
yes, but like this is precisely where the question of these finessing, like when you get pushed on this stuff and you start saying, well, actually, no, there are going to be overarching relations of this type or that type or the other, even simply describing it in terms of like, well, things will be open to information, communication, and transition.
Well, no, I think that you're being ridiculous at this point. I mean, you know, this is coming out of a libertarian lineage. You're not seriously suggesting that libertarians make it as some kind of weird concession that they would have an open commercial system. I mean, that's the essence of the libertarian tradition. You know, it's like they're the only people who have ever consistently and relentlessly held to that notion. So this isn't something
I'm not arguing against them, I'm arguing against you, and I'm arguing against.
Well, this is, but I'm just coming out of this tradition. I mean, we're talking about Friedman's.
I'm sorry that I haven't read the Friedman piece, like, but the point is that there are unacknowledged consequences to radicalizing libertarianism in this direction, right? And the whole thing that I'm trying to push is that you end up having to acknowledge some kind of minimally transversal structures connecting the things that are being fragmented, right? And you need to do that even on your own terms, on your terms of optimizing of intelligence, right? Right, on those terms, right? In order to actually have optimality, you need some kind of global structure, even if it's not.
But I think that you're putting it a bit upside down. I mean, game theory is a theory of coordination from units that have not got any kind of authoritative, overarching structure about them. They're radically fragmented, absolutely fragmented units of whatever scale. You know, states, individuals, it works at all levels. And of course, the whole result of this is how you establish, in your terms, transversal relations, coordination, networks, all of this stuff. I mean, this is the philosophy of those systems. You know, but it's just the difference is rather than assuming that you've got some authoritative, centralized, universal structure, you actually should generate that stuff out of the dynamics of a fragmented distributed system. So it's, to say that networks are somehow on your side of this rather than my side of this, I think is just not at all the case. All network theory is much more on my side of this
I
argument.
completely disagree. And I think the comment about game theory actually sort of like deals it to some extent insofar as, actually, no, game theory isn't radically open. Game theory is about games and specific game settings, right? The rules are set in advance. Game theory is not about the negotiation, right, of those rules within which you play. Right? You can use game theory to model situations, but only given certain very specific assumptions about.
Well, they're not very specific assumptions. If you want a simple model, you have a simple model. But the game theoretical stance is based upon the elimination of presupposed relations between elements, so that those relations have to be constructed strategically out of the interaction of those elements. It's an elimination of presupposed relations, and this is why it's scandalous to people.
No.
Because it's not making assumptions to do with solidarity and universal agreement and all of this kind of stuff that people feel comfortable with.
This is where the formalism actually tells against you, right? Which is one important thing that is fixed in any game description, right?
Any specific game description,
yeah.
For sure. But that's the mathematical formalization of a game. It's not game theory is not describable just to the set of all mathematical descriptions of specific games. It's a method for formalizing. It's a method for formalizing the emergence of strategic relations between distributed populations.
Yes.
And it's an open domain. There's an infinite number of increasingly complicated games that can be modeled. They will all be game theoretical. I mean, it's just like the basic principles of computation. Anything can be modeled by a Turing machine, and it will be extremely complicated, and a lot of those things have not yet been modeled by it, but it's still computation. The theory of computation still holds, just like the matrix of game theory still holds on games that are intractably complicated to our current capabilities for modeling.
Okay, right, but so we're on the level of formalism, and we're happy with that to some extent, right? The thing that game theory can't effectively deal with is arbitrary revisability of motivation, right?
As soon as you can say anything, the fact that you think you've got a level of formalism available to you in linguistic communication that is not available to game theory, I think is an illusion. If you can say it, game theory can do it. You're formalizing it and saying it to us. If you can say those words, arbitrary revisability of motivation, and that means something, if that's not just white noise that you're just sharing with us, if that has meaning, then it is accessible to game theory as it is to the linguistic processor.
And very, very quickly, why I am denying your claims about the formalization here, right? Which is that I spent quite a long time studying Jean-Yves Girard's Ludix, right? Which is an attempt to provide a game approach, right, to this issue of what's possible to even start seeing something, what's presupposed in this, even the possibility of articulating something, right? Ludix, by the way, is an alternative way to frame computation, right? Because it can you can describe computational systems in terms of the interactive behavior in it. Now, what's most interesting about Ludix, from a formal perspective, is that it is not game theory. It looks like game theory, right? In fact, what Girard successfully manages to do is to find within the geometric structure of proof theory, sequent calculus, a kind of interactivity. Like he shows basically how you can turn proof trees into something like strategies, like choice trees, right? And show how these interact, right? But the really fascinating and deep insight in this is that what is not fixed, although the spaces of possible action are fixed, What is not fixed is the motivation, which is the other aspect of game theory. Game theory crucially deals with not simply interactive spaces in the sense of the spaces of possible action you can both deal with, but rather the tendencies governing how you will both act given your different motivations and your knowledge of one another's motivations, right? This is why I'm like there are specific formal reasons for rejecting flippant claims about the universalization of game theory. There are formalisms that are deeper, and these are in fact formalisms that describe the process through which the possibility of disagreement emerges from prior agreement. Niche competition, and in Girard's Ludics, niche competition is precisely terminating computation, right? Niche competition, terminating computation, emerges out of a prior, messy kind of collaboration, interaction which is not well typed and not well structured, right? So I should stop at this point, but like there are very, very specific reasons in the formalism to reject the claim.
Well,
game theory.
I mean, look, I'm not going to push you too far, but you can see why that would engender skepticism. I mean, like, you know, either you can formalize those problems, or in which case they're formal problems, and in which case they're tractable to game theory, or you can't formalize them, in which case why should anyone pretend that we can even understand what is being said? I mean, you seem to be wanting to have your cake and eat it here and saying that there's like these limits to formalization that we can formally demonstrate exist, and that's
that's absolutely not what I said, right? Right. What I said is a particular assumption of game theory that you were leaning on, right?
Which is what?
The fixity of motivation.
No, why have I said anything about the fixity of motivation? I mean, you know, if you think that the variation of motivation is an important factor, there's nothing that's going to stop that being built into a theory of games about it at all. You just put it into a meta game where changes in incentive structures are part of the game. I mean, you know, if you can formalize it, game theory can deal with it.
But
You're trying to just impose some arbitrary limit on what game theory can do.
No. It's not an arbitrary limit, right? In fact, it's precisely the kind of formal limit you're accusing me of like.
What?
Look, okay, so here's the issue, right? When you're talking about the transition between game and metagame, right? At each point that you want to start talking about changes in motivation, which aren't necessarily the same as changes in the space of possible action, right? You have to retreat to some broader but equally fixed conception of what the what the space of motivation and action are, right?
But that's just to say it has to be formalized, and it has to be formalized just to be communicated meaningfully.
No, but
it's not. The game theory accepts it, like any formal theory accepts it, just because it wants to communicate sense rather than nonsense, doesn't it? It wants to produce a computable, rigorously computable model. If it was happy to just have blurry, informal suggestions, then of course it wouldn't have this problem.
It's not about informality, right? It's about how you formally think about, right, these transitions, right? How do you, so what you have is, I've got one fixed model, and I go, that's inadequate, and you go, it's fine, I've pulled another model out of a hat, right, which is broader, right? There is a formal question about how that hat pulling happens, right? And that hat pulling and the formal study of it is something which is deeper than the specifics of the game theory that you're, and there's an actual crucial upshot of this, right? There's a really crucial and important upshot of this, which is what game theory can't deal with. And this is where we get back into normative political theorizing. What it can't deal with is the importance of the fact that often we don't know what we want, right? And what I mean by that quite specifically is we have some idea, right, but not a complete idea of.
But that's informality again, isn't it? You're saying the system that aims to formalize strategic thinking cannot deal with fuzzy, confused, non-formal strategic orientations. Well, of course.
Well,
You know,
not of course.
no one's communicating about that. All you're saying is just like it's fuzzy and complicated and
No,
confusing.
absolutely wrong, because you can formalize what you're calling the fuzziness, right? There's actual formal questions, deeper formal questions than the formalism you're putting forward. For thinking about.
I need to.
Sorry, this is a bit. We've possibly gone off on a weird
Oh,
tangent.
I think that there's a can of worms opening. We're getting because this will probably never end. This debate is going on.
Yeah,
for a long time.
it's interesting,
And
but I am sort of probably torturing everyone here a little bit.
No, I think everybody's very interested in this debate, or maybe it's just me. But I just want to kind of like bracket this, and maybe we can do this again.
Fair enough.
But it's like 1:30 for Nick. I want to make sure that students can have a wrap up with the class that they're in. Thank you, Pete, for being here.
Yeah, sorry for taking things off in a bizarre formal direction.
No, I think it's actually really relevant, everything you've said, to the issues that we've been trying to talk about.
It was good for not knowing what we were talking about coming in. It was good. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Have a nice movie night.
I'll leave and I'll let everything wrap up naturally.
Okay, thanks. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Later.
It was just not. I was probably going to keep going. So.
Maybe we could do a last round of comment and then wrap up. Is that happy with people? Is that satisfactory?
Yeah, because I think in the sidebar there's a lot. I mean, Anders has a lot of things. I don't know if he wants to come in and say some things. Saying a lot in the sidebar, but.
Yeah, I could just kind of restate I'm starting to see what you're getting at with this class a lot more clearly, I think. Amy's comments were really helpful. And I've had these thoughts before, but it's so hard to remember them, about how agency can be factored out, and then it's not. I was calling it Patravision because I had a talk with Amy about that, but this kind of overview where there's no agency and no centeredness, but something that's not an overview that looks like its own type of centered position, and I think that might have been what Pete was kind of critiquing just now. But from that decentered position, it looks truly decentered. So then it gets into like, what are we even talking about? How are we defining who's controlling what happens next at which level? I was saying, who's steering this boat?
Yeah. I mean, obviously the collective pronoun becomes stressed, doesn't it? You know, like if you allow certain kind of we's, then you're already presupposing a lot. You know, Patchy Friedman's whole thing on one level is a certain abandonment of a collective program, isn't it? Of just to say, look, we aren't going to do anything, so let's scale it down to a much more restrictive sense of collectivity than we've been dealing with at this point. If we is us here, then it's a lot easier, I think, for sure. I'll look through. Yeah, I can see you've been very busy in the sidebar, and so I'll.
Yeah, I was just trying to restate my understanding to see if it was matching up with what other people were thinking, and thinking that what we were talking about Like this idea: is it possible for things to be other than they are? If there's already de facto Darwinianism, who can make a decision different in that situation?
I think the Darwinian thing is interesting. Obviously, I think everything Pete was talking about was interesting, and one of them is this thing about how substantive is this Darwinian thing. For me, it's interesting because it is minimally substantive. It's like just what you end up with when you strip a whole bunch of other things out. Rather than, there's a construction of it, a critical construction where you say, oh, you've got this kind of fixation on Darwinism being a great thing and you're pushing that hard. But I would put it the other way around, that it's just like, if you really don't think that there are these structures of plausible agreement, if you're going to get right down to basics, what are you left with after you've torn out everything that you can tear out, then that's the thing that deserves to be called Darwinism. Experimentation and selection. If you want to give that another name, you can, but it seems to me pointless given that that's surely what Darwinism means. But I think that's a really huge thing, and I think the fact it's important to Pete shows that. I mean, it's like, there's no way someone can grant what I'm saying about the status of Darwinism without giving away much more than they probably feel happy with, because most of what's going on in this whole course, you get for free once you accept that when you tear things down to the baseline, you've got this kind of structure, competitive, selective mechanism.
I'm wondering if I could ask a brief question.
Sure.
Yeah, so with regard to the normativity point, I kind of hopped in slightly late, but I'm wondering if it follows a distinction of deontology versus consequentialism, like the ends in themselves versus means in ethics or moral theory.
The relationship between that distinction and the whole question about normativity, I think, is complicated, because I think both consequentialism, as best represented by various forms of utilitarianism, and deontology are both systematically Western in the fact that they're very comfortable with the fact-value distinction.
Yeah, sure.
With orthogonal structures. And my level of interrogation would really want to point beyond that. Like, as a utilitarian or as a Kantian moral theorist, you could still be equally happy about criticizing the naturalistic fallacy as Pete was. I simply do not think there is such a thing as the naturalistic fallacy. I think the naturalistic fallacy is not a fallacy. I think Western philosophical tradition has gone deeply wrong in thinking there is such a thing as the naturalistic fallacy, and that we've been talking about this in previous weeks in terms of diagonal critical thinking, like between facts and values there is a diagonal, not an orthogonal relationship. I don't think this can become huge because it's not a trivial claim that's obviously being made.
No, okay. Yes. So with regard to the absence of the fallacy of naturalism, there's an aspect of I don't know, power, social Darwinism almost, and a practicality, I guess. That's more in the East than in the West. Some parts of the East.
Well, that would be my inclination.
Yes.
Again, it's not a trivial claim, but I think that the Chinese philosophical tradition is far less susceptible to orthogonal argument than the Western tradition. Mm-hmm. And if you have a notion like self-cultivation as a basic moral principle, is that on the fact side or the value side? Clearly, it doesn't work. It's diagonal. In talking about something as a process of self-cultivation, you're describing it naturalistically, and you're also affirming it normatively, and
I-
neither of those registers is obviously primary over the other. I think that it's essentially diagonal ethical dimension, isn't it? Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So I hope everyone's kind of, obviously it's been an eccentrically structured event this week, and I hope that's cool with everyone. And I've very much enjoyed all your participation. There's still a few minutes if anyone wants to say anything now. Otherwise, I would optimistically say that I will talk to you again next week. And thanks a lot for your involvement.